Hey everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to tell a very short story and I'll make a little announcement, see how that goes over. Exactly a year ago at this conference, I was standing outside with my friend Richard Lamarchand, and we discussed the merits of a history of a community. And I said, well, it'd be really nice if we had something that was more persistent than YouTube or blog posts and stuff like that to document the kinds of things that we're hearing here at the conference. And someone suggested, I think it was Drew Davidson, suggested we should have a journal, and you should be the editor-in-chief. I was like, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. I already have a job. Today, I would like to announce that it took a year, and a lot of laziness on my side, but we have NYU Press backing, NYU Libraries. There will be an online, open access, peer-reviewed journal that we have tentatively titled Practice, the Journal of Game Design. Without going into too much detail, the basic idea is that it is a multiple format journal to which you can submit creative and original work that does not have to adhere to a specific citation standard or anything like this. And it will have different tracks and different area editors for different kinds of communities. And the experiment is to see if we can actually get this all under one roof. Right? I want to see something where everyone can submit, share ideas, publish original work, and most importantly, have something that has archival quality with DOI numbers, ISSN, all that stuff. Right? And yes, of course, the person who had the idea is also going to be the editor-in-chief. So that work sticks with me. If you're at all interested in this, please come see me at some point and talk to me about it. I'll gladly elaborate. We have a lot of details to work out, but we'll get there. Hopefully there'll be a call for submissions early next year, and we'll have a first issue by the summer. That's very ambitious, and we'll see if it works. Anyway, moving right along. With great excitement, I'm going to introduce our next speaker because this is the game that I've played by far the most this year. So our next speaker is Lukas Litzsinger. What's going on behind? Our next speaker is Lukas Litzsinger, who is the lead designer at Fantasy Flight Games on Android Netrunner, which is the reimagining of an older franchise from a CCG from the mid-90s, 96, I think, that was designed by Richard Garfield originally. And he's going to give us all the details on this. And I'm very excited to bring him up stage. So Lukas, would you please start?
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. Can everybody in the back hear me? Is this good? Yeah. All right, awesome. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you very much for the NYU Game Center for inviting me out here. I hope that you guys learned something from this presentation, or if you don't, at least you are entertained slightly. So normally I'd start out with a joke to break the ice, but I'm a corp man now, so I won't. My name is Lukas Litzsinger. Hopefully you never have to write it because it's difficult to spell. I'm a game designer at Fantasy Flight Games. I've been there for almost 4 years now, and it's gone so fast. Some of the projects that I've worked on have been Warhammer Invasion, the card game, The Lord of the Rings, the card game, Sid Meier's Civilization. I did one of the expansions for that, and then the upcoming XCOM, the board game, which is really exciting. It's the first board game that we've done that has a digital component integrated into the game. So that should be out pretty soon, hopefully by the end of the year. There's also another game that Andy mentioned that I've worked on a lot, and that's Android Netrunner. So I'm just going to play a short video to give you an introduction to what that is. I'm not sure we actually have sound. Anybody hear that? No.
Android Netrunner is a two-player living card game set in a dystopian cyberpunk future where monolithic corporations control the vast majority of human interests. The corporation works to advance its agendas, while a subversive hacker known as a runner attempts to access and steal those agendas. To win the game, each player needs to score 7 points from advanced or stolen agendas, but from there, the corporation and runner's methods diverge. Corporations seek to score agendas by advancing them, which costs both clicks and credits. To buy the time and earn the credits they need, they must secure their servers with powerful security programs called ICE. ICE comes in different varieties, from simple barriers to aggressive sentries. Runners need to spend their clicks and credits to acquire the tools of the hacker trade, installing the necessary hardware and icebreaker programs to run past the corporation's security measures. Filled with calculated bluffs and high-stakes hacks, Android Netrunner allows you to change your reality one run at a time. Welcome to the future. Welcome to Android Netrunner.
So that's kind of the first chapter of our tutorial videos. So if you kind of want to get a broader overview of the game, you can go to the Fantasy Flight website and watch a couple of more of those that go in depth as to some of the actual mechanics of the game. So that's Android Netrunner. Well, how did we get to Android Netrunner? It all began back in 1996 with a game called Netrunner CCG, and it was designed by Richard Garfield. Probably have heard of him. He's done some other games. And it had 2 sets with about 580 cards in it, and it came in a dual starter that looked like that. There was a corp deck and a runner deck, and you could take out this little rule book that was pretty interesting. There's actually a copy of this lying around the office when I first got hired at FFG, and I'm like, oh, what's this game? I've heard of this game, but I've never played it, so I took out the rule book and I got to page 2 and it's like, here are 30 terms you need to learn to play this game. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. Like ice, data forts, resing. It's like, what is this game? So I read the whole rule book from that 30-page glossary all the way to the end where it asks you to subscribe to the Duelist magazine for only $17.95 or $22.95 if you're Canadian. And so some of the cards in that box looked like this. You have corp cards at the top, and then you have runner cards at the bottom. And the game was kind of a holy grail for a lot of CCG players. Like, I knew it was considered to be an excellent design. And then once I started playing it, I realized that it really was an excellent design. And sadly, it just didn't quite take off when it was released originally back in the mid-1990s. So a couple of months after kind of diving into the game a little bit just for fun, I was actually given an assignment, and the assignment was to take Netrunner and convert it from a CCG into an LCG set in the Android universe. So Netrunner I've just introduced, but what is Android? Well, Android was a board game that Fantasy Flight released in 2008. It was designed by Kevin Wilson, who's done other games such as Descent and Sid Meier's Civilization. And the IP for the game was created from scratch by Kevin Wilson and Dan Clark. And in the game, you actually go around and collect leads and investigate. You're kind of a detective, and you're trying to solve a crime. If you've ever wanted to frame noise for murder, this is your game. You can do that. And it's a pretty long game as well, but it's a lot of cool narrative elements going on in the game. And so there were kind of the 2 parts of the process. One was the CCG to LCG conversion, and one was the Cyberpunk 2020 IP into the Android IP. So the differences between a CCG and an LCG are that a CCG has random distribution. So you buy a booster pack and you open it and you don't know what's in the pack. You know the rarity distribution usually, but you don't actually know the cards that you're getting. In a living card game, which is something that Fantasy Flight created a couple of years ago, you actually have a fixed distribution, which means you know every card that you're getting in the pack. So you don't have to be like, oh, I didn't get anything good. It's like, nope, you know exactly what you're buying when you buy it. Because a CCG uses that rarity, kind of distribution, the sets are much larger so that there's variety in the packs, and so you want to buy more packs. Because we tell you everything that you're getting in a pack, our sets are usually smaller. So you might have like 300 cards in a regular CCG release. In a living card game release, you're generally 60 cards, which is 20 different cards, and you get a full play set, which is 3 of each. CCG also releases a couple of expansions a year, again, because their sets are bigger. While in an LCG, we try to release monthly packs so that the meta is always changing and always keeping the game fresh. So there's also differences from changing the game from the Cyberpunk 2020 universe into the Android universe, and this was something I really wanted to make sure was done correctly. I like a lot of kind of top-down or thematic design, and so I was definitely inspired by a lot of the additions to the game by the Android universe itself. I realize that my bullets are kind of redundant for Cyberpunk 2020, but it is a Cyberpunk universe set in 2020. And it takes place mostly in Night City, which is in California. Android, on the other hand, takes place in New Angeles, which is not in California. It's actually in Ecuador, though it is still part of the United States. That's where the space elevator was built. So the main difference, I think, between the Cyberpunk 2020 universe and the Android universe was that Android is a little more cyber noir, kind of going back to that original board game where it's more of a kind of like 20s detective caper. It's got a lot of atmosphere to it, but it isn't quite as grim and gritty as a regular Cyberpunk universe. So Android is not quite as dystopian. There's actually a lot of cool things going on. We haven't destroyed the planet. You know, we've actually colonized the moon and Mars, and while there are corporations that wield the power of governments, they've actually increased the quality of life for millions and billions of people around the world. The year of Android is indeterminate. Yeah, it's true. I am a court man. You have to remember that. Got to spin everything. The year of Android is indeterminate. We don't want to set an actual century on it because we kind of want people to figure out what seems, kind of the most, makes the most sense for them. Otherwise, you end up dating yourself. Like, you could say, like, oh, yeah, it's like, 21, 22, 23, 24. Eventually, you're going to get to those years, and, people look back and like, ha, 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 they were wrong. Maybe they won't. We'll probably be long gone by then. So there are a lot of things we changed with the game, but there are also a lot of things that we didn't change with the game, and I do want to highlight some of those and talk about why Netrunner, the original design by Richard Garfield, is so brilliant and ahead of its time. The first thing is asymmetric gameplay. So in Netrunner, one player is the corp and one player is the runner, and there are incredible differences when playing either side. As the corp, you will install all of your cards face down. So there's hidden information that the runner has to deal with. As the runner, you install all of your cards face up. And so this asymmetry was at the core of the game, and that was something that obviously you can't really change without changing the game itself. There's another characteristic of Netrunner which is pretty unique in a lot of card games, and that is you build a tableau during the course of the game. So in most games, you might play a card, and then your opponent's like, boom, I blew your card up. And you're like, well, boom, boom, I blew your card up. And it goes back and forth over and over and over again, and you end up with like one card in play. If not, with Netrunner, when you play a card, it stays in play. And so you're going to kind of continually be given more and more options as the game goes on. You can end up with really intricate play spaces. So it almost has this feeling of like you're building your engine and you're keeping the pieces in play as the game progresses, and so it actually builds up over the course of the game. There's also an action economy in the game, and again, like this was released in 1996. Settlers of Catan came out in 1995, but Euro games didn't actually take off until kind of the early 2000s, and so I think this is also one of the reasons that Netrunner has shown such crossover appeal, is that it appeals to this, really hardcore card game crowd, and it also appeals to this really a little bit more casual board game crowd because of the action economy inherent in the game. So on your turn as the runner, you get to spend 4 actions, or what we call clicks in the new game, and the corp you get to spend 3. And these are incredibly flexible. These cards show the available actions that you have. So as the runner, you could just spend 1 click to draw 1 card. You could also spend a click to gain a credit, which is the resource in the game. You could spend a click to play a card, you could spend a click and 2 credits to remove a tag, and you could spend a click to make a run, which is kind of the heart of the game. The corp has different actions available. You might notice they have an action that's 3 clicks to purge virus counters. And this kind of plays back into the asymmetry of the game. So there's a very elegant click system here, but there's also this very thematic kind of asymmetrical use of it in the game space. And that kind of gives it a flair that most games don't have. There's also a persistent economy in the game. So you might have 5 credits in your credit pool. You click 4 times to gain 4 more credits, and you'll end your turn with 9 credits. And you'll keep them, and you'll start your turn with 9 credits. So in a lot of card games, you generate resources, and then at the end of the turn, those resources might go away. But in this case, they stick around. There's also a bluffing card. Anybody who's played Android Netrunner knows that if the corp installs these face down, it's kind of tense. Anybody want to guess which one is the agenda and which one's the trap?
The right one.
Right one? Right one is what?
Well, agenda.
Agenda, all right. Well, you're correct. The right one is the agenda. The corp player installed in advance twice. Pretty typical for a 5 advancement agenda. And the left one is the trap. So this kind of goes back to the bluffing element of being able to install your cards face down as the corp. And if you hit the left one, you are dead. If you hit the right one, you've just scored 3 of the 7 points needed to win. So before I talk about what we changed, I'm kind of curious, just like how many people have actually played Android Netrunner? Wow, that's a lot. And how many people have played the original Netrunner? Okay, so that is pretty impressive. And for everybody who's played the original Netrunner, some of this might make a little more sense, but I'll hopefully be able to explain it so everybody can kind of see what we did with the game. So there were a couple of very easy changes that we made to the game. For example, in the original 1996 release, you could have as many copies of card as you wanted in your deck. The idea was that you're going to be limited by the size of your wallet. That turned out not to be the case. So if you wanted 30 of a card, you could put 30 of a card in, provided you could get 30 of a card, which people could. So in the new game with the LCG model, we restrict it to 3 copies of a card in your deck. We also added some new types of ice. So the old game didn't have trap ice or Bioroid ice or anything like that, and that kind of came from this top-down thematic design. We removed hidden resources. Hidden resources were a card type that were introduced in the Proteus expansion, the one and only expansion for Netrunner, and they were basically cards that the runner played face down and kind of gave them this hidden information. And I felt like this undermined the asymmetry of the game, and so I decided to remove them, and I have no plans on ever bringing them back. We also revised the timing structure, or rather added a timing structure to the game. If you read the original rulebook, it's very narrative-based. It's kind of interesting. Like, they talk to a player in like green text as the runner, and then they switch to another color text, and now they're talking to the corp. So one of the things that we did is we wrote a very technical rulebook, complete with a timing structure for the game. Sadly, it's not the greatest to teach the game. I do recommend that you watch our videos if you want to learn more about it, or find someone who shows you the game. The barrier for entry is a little bit high just on the complexity level, but once you get into the game, it's actually very, very simple. So there are some other things that obviously would be a little bit more difficult to change, and one of the things is that we added factions. And this is probably the most important change that we made to the game. So in the original CCG, you had corp cards and you had runner cards, and you could put any corp cards you wanted together in a deck, and you could put any runner cards you wanted together in a deck. And so why did we decide to add factions to a game that, worked and is excellent and incredible? Well, kind of the main reason, I think, is this concept of limitations breeding creativity. So, for example, say you're on a long car ride and you have nothing to do. I know we have smartphones now, so maybe this is the mid-1990s, just like the original release. But what do you do in a car when you have nothing to do? Anyone? play games, think, right? You might have heard of something like the alphabet game, and which is a pretty terrible game. But that game was invented probably because somebody had a long car or bus ride, and they're like, well, we want to do something, so let's do something. It obviously wasn't invented in a library. That'd be a really dumb place to play that game. And so they were limited by their environment, and they had this spontaneous idea of, we're just going to go through the alphabet A to Z. It's a really stupid game. The player who's sitting closest to the driver usually wins because they get to see all the letters first. But that's an example of like a limitation breeding creativity, and I think we saw it yesterday as well with the open problems session, which was really awesome, where there was a very specific problem, and then people would shout ideas, and some of them applied and some of them didn't apply, but the limitations of the project kind of created this space where creativity could flourish. So a big part of the limiting of the player by adding factions to each side is that it prevents deck homogenization. So a lot of times, if you could put all of the best cards together in a deck, you will put all of the best cards together in a deck. It's like the path of least resistance. It's like, if I need to take my couch into my first floor apartment, I just pick it up and take it into my apartment. If I need to take my couch to my third floor apartment and I can't fit it around the stairs, well, now I have to figure out something else to do, and it becomes more difficult, and I actually have to start thinking about it. And so this is kind of the way it works in card games, where if I want to build a good deck, I just put all the good cards together. But by introducing factions, we actually tell the players, like, nope, you can't fit this card in with this card. We don't let you do it. And so now they actually have to figure out other ways to kind of gain an advantage. Every card player wants to create the Sauron deck, which is the one deck to rule them all. The unbeatable deck, like, haha, I bring out my deck and I never lose because it's unbeatable. And so as the designer, we want to allow them to have that delusion, but we don't want to actually give it to them. And so that's kind of what we do with a faction system, because we give faction strengths and weaknesses, and we never make it possible to cover all the weaknesses of a faction. This also opens up design space. So because we can create cards that are more difficult to put together, we can actually make those cards more powerful, which gives us more opportunities to create cards. This is another important one. It kind of links mechanics with themes. So if I say, I'm playing my noise deck, what do you expect? Viruses, exactly. So I've now created kind of a language that is tied to the game, and it both references the Android IP, the in-universe explanation, and it tells you something about what's actually in my deck. And then finally, allows for personal expression. A lot of players kind of identify with one or two factions and potentially even play those factions exclusively just because they kind of like how the cards work, it kind of fits their play style, or they like thematically what those factions represent. And so as part of the faction system, we added identity cards to the game. So you actually pick your faction at the beginning of the game, and this kind of locks you into your choice. And this also kind of puts a face to the runner that's going up against the corp, and also allows us to thematically distinguish the corporations from each other. So I knew we needed factions for these reasons in the game, but the question was, how many factions? Everybody probably knows, well, some people know how many we ended up with. My first guess was this many factions. This was wrong. This was too many factions. It became readily apparent when I started to kind of divide the color pie among the factions. So this was my first attempt at defining the runner factions. I listed a bunch of game mechanics on the left-hand side of the spreadsheet. I listed the factions across the top, and I started to assign mechanics to those runner factions. And by the time you get to that last column, which is the Dreamhead column, there's not very many X's left. And so I'm like, all right, so 5 was a little bit too many. Let's try 4. And this was an improvement, but I didn't think it went far enough. And so I ended up with 3 different runner factions instead of the initial 5. In addition, and that was kind of a mechanical limitation, just looking at what the game gave me as far as design space and then assigning them to factions. In addition, there were also distribution limitations. So one thing we like to do with a core set is to create opportunities for players to build a lot of different decks and introduce all of the factions in one box. And I knew we were looking at about 240 cards, so I had to do a little bit of math. Sometimes you have to do some math as a designer. It's inevitable, really. Thankfully, this is very simple math. I'm just like, okay. So I decided, we're going to have 45 cards as a minimum deck size. And so if I have 9 factions in the game, since now I have, say, 5 Corp, 4 Runner, or something like that, that's 405 cards, which is 165 cards too many. So I can't even fit that many factions in the box. And one thing I think is really important is that you can take that faction, you can put all those cards together, and then you can go to a tournament and you can play that. I'm not interested in giving people just a deck that isn't tournament legal out of the box so that they show up and people are like, no, that's just a demo deck. You can't actually use that. I want people to actually feel like they're playing the real game from the very beginning of opening the box. So there were 2 things I did to solve this problem. One is I ended up with this many factions in the game, 7. And the other thing I did was I added neutral cards that you combined with each of the factions so that you take all of the Shaper cards or all of the Hospiroid cards, and then you shuffle in this pack of neutrals. And those neutrals kind of get you up to that minimum deck size that you need. So these are the 4 corporations that we ended up with. And it is an asymmetrical number, 4 versus 3, for a couple of reasons. The main reason is that there was just more thematic ground to cover on the corp side. I can't imagine the game without any of these corporations. The Android IP is defined by Hospiroid and Jinteki, thus the name Android. Hospiroid creates Bioroids, Jinteki creates clones, and they have a rivalry. They're fighting over this like cheap labor market. And so those 2 are integral to the IP, so they have to be in there. Wayland built the space elevator, which allowed us to start colonizing space at a much greater frequency. And so they're also very important to the IP, and so they had to be in there. And then you can't have a game about hacking without an information company. And so NVN kind of had to be in there as well. And some of the other factions that we had in the game originally have actually shown up, such as Blue Sun, the energy company that I wanted, is now a subdivision of Wayland, since Wayland is actually a consortium and they own many other companies. Argus Security, which is coming out, was also originally a core faction, and then they are also reappearing as a sub-corporation of Wayland. These were the 3 runner factions we ended up with, Anarch, Criminal, and Shaper, and I think the credit for this actually goes to Dan Clark. I was kind of beating my head against the wall. I'm like, I can't find the 3 terms that describe what I want. I was kind of describing what they did, so like Anarchs were actually like infectors because they deal with viruses and stuff, but that's actually just one part of their color pie, and it doesn't describe them as a whole. And so Dan was like, well, we should describe, who they are, not what they do. And that was kind of the breakthrough that we needed to end up with the Anarch, Criminal, and Shaper factions. So after having our factions, we also needed to figure out how we mixed factions. Because while limitations are good, you actually also want to provide an environment for players to show their own creativity. It's kind of the game before the game. When you sit down at your table and you lay out all your cards and you start putting cards together, we don't want to just create a bunch of mini card pools. We do want to allow you to take some faction cards and put them with others. So how did we do that? Well, my first idea was a skill check. And each time you played an out-of-faction card, you discarded the top card of your deck. The skill rating of the discarded card had to equal or exceed the skill rating of the card displayed. This was not a very good idea for many reasons. One is that it was kind of complicated. 2 was that it actually just made you run through your deck super quickly. And as a runner especially, I guess even as a corp even more especially, but as the runner, your deck is kind of your life, because if you run out of cards in hand and you take damage, you're flatlined and dead. And as the corp, it's actually even worse, because if you're discarding cards off the top of your deck, those might be agendas which the runner can steal to win the game. And so it just didn't really work within the content and context of the game itself. So I'm like, all right, I need a new system. And I was kind of inspired by this game called Blue Moon. That was released originally in 2004. And it's designed by Rainer Knizia. And we actually just re-released a full, complete version of it called Blue Moon Legends. It's an excellent game. It's one of my favorites. And in Blue Moon, you can actually mix cards of various factions just by spending something called blue moons, maybe not surprisingly, which are at the bottom of each card. So you can maybe kind of see it like this Volca card over here has 2 moons in the bottom left-hand corner. And so that's actually a resource that you're spending before you even play the game in order to mix it in with the other factions of Blue Moon. So I'm like, this is actually a pretty interesting idea. I really like the system in Blue Moon. Let's try it out in Netrunner. And it turned out to work really, really well. So in Netrunner, we actually have an influence value on each card, and each identity has points that they can use to spend on that influence. So does anybody have like a gift card right now? Anybody have unused gift cards? Yep. What is it to? Do you mind telling us? Visa gift card, right? Well, you feel kind of compelled to spend it, right? Or as long as you go without spending that card, you're like, I'm just like wasting it, just sitting there. I got to do something with it. And so basically what we did is we gave each identity a gift card. And we're like, here, go out and buy cool stuff with this. So Noise, for example, he has 15 influence in the bottom right-hand corner. That's that 15 number below the 45. And he can use that on any out-of-faction cards. And if you don't use it, you don't get any refunds. It's just sitting there, and it's unused, and it's taunting you. Like, you didn't spend all your influence. What an idiot. And so, for example, he can put in like 2 copies of Forged Activation Orders, and the influence value in each card is those little dots in the bottom right-hand corner. He can put in 2 copies of Aesop's Pawn Shop. He can put in a copy of Diesel, a copy of Account Siphon, and a copy of Femme Fatale, and that spends his 15 influence. This does a lot of different things for the game, and the most important one is that first off, it protects the identity of each faction. By picking your identity and having a set number of influence, the majority of your deck is going to be the faction that you slap down on the table. So if I'm going up against Noise, I know to expect a lot of Anarch cards and probably a lot of viruses, and that's not going to change. However, influence is invisible during gameplay, which kind of puts the game back into that pure state of the original CCG, which I really wanted to protect. So if you're playing Android Netrunner, it will feel pretty much exactly the same during play as the original Netrunner, because this system doesn't add any complication to the actual game. It only adds complication before the game. And I think that's actually a really important point. It does, as I said, encourage mixing by giving you gift cards to spend, and then it provides a lot of granularity. So there's a lot of actually different ways to spend influence. A 1 influence card is very different than a 2 or a 3 influence card. Something else that we changed was tracing. And so in the original game, you might run into an ice like Data Raven, and this has a trace on it, and tracing was a way for the corp to fire different effects. Usually it could tag the runner, which gave them important information about you. And if you ran into the Data Raven and the trace fired, you and the corp, you as the runner and the corp would secretly spend credits. And so the corp might spend 3 credits, and the Data Raven has a trace of 5. It's really hard to see there, but it's a trace of 5, and that's the trace limit. So the corp can spend up to 5 credits, and for each credit they spend, they get a strength. So they would end up with 3 strength. The runner, on the other hand, has to use a card called a link card to both establish a base link and to boost the link using the second value on the card. So using the access to Arasaka link, the runner would spend 4 credits and end up with a trace strength of 5, 2 credits to establish a base link of 2, 2 credits to get +1 link. Other than that system being incredibly complicated, it was also non-interactive, because if the runner didn't have a link, then they couldn't even participate in the trace. So if the runner doesn't have that access to Arasaka card installed, then the corp is just going to win the trace. The main problem, though, was that runners just didn't ever install those cards because they were expensive to use, and you might not even run into a trace. So why bother? If you do, oh well. So I'm like, tracing is cool. Let's fix it. So my first idea was to move the base link to the runner identity card. So the way this would work is that access to Arasaka card is replaced. Whoops. There we go. Is replaced by Noise here. And he has a little +1, which means that he can spend 1 credit to get +1 to his link. So now when Noise runs into the Data Raven, he can spend 1 credit to get 1 link. If the corp is spending basically anything more than 1, in this case it would be really stupid for the corp to spend 3, but for the purposes of my example, I'm keeping it the same. If the corp spends 3, then they win the trace because noise can only spend 1 credit to establish the base link. This idea was not so good. If the runner did not stack link, it was always about the maximization of 1 credit. So now I have a game where we're taking time away from the actual game to figure out whether or not I lose 1 credit. That's really exciting. It was also incredibly difficult for the runner to win traces, and you still didn't really want to play link cards because you might not actually run into any traces as well. So I kind of came up with another idea, and in this idea, the trace value and the link value are actually a starting value, and each player secretly bids as many credits as they want and can increase their strength 1 to 1. So now it's just like, I have a starting strength, you have a starting strength, we'll secretly bid, add our strength together, and see what we come up with. So the Data Raven starts out at 5, I bid 3 as the corp, now I got 8 strength. Noise starts out at 1, I bid 4, now I got 5 strength. Really, really pretty simple. We maintained the secret bid, and this was the worst idea yet because it completely destroyed the economy of the game. Because if I run into an important trace, I'm going to bid everything to win that trace, and you might bid everything to win that trace, and now we have no money, and we have to spend like 4 turns just click for credit, click for credit, click for credit. Really, really boring. So that was a bad idea. So my third idea was to actually remove the blind bid and say that the trace and link value, just like the last system, were starting bids, but there's an open bid now where the corp bids first. So kind of going back to our example, the Data Raven and noise. In this case, the Data Raven starts at trace 3. The corp can spend 3 credits to boost it to trace 6. And now the runner must decide whether or not it is worth it to spend the 6 credits to beat the trace, or they can choose to spend nothing, and then the trace will succeed. So this was actually the system that we ended up on, and I kind of simplified these into 3 ideas. There are actually probably more like 15 ideas. There were slight variations and mixes of these. We tried a lot of systems, but the benefit of this system was that it removes uncertainty from the runner side, and it creates a push your luck element for the corp side. So now the corp is actually trying to decide how valuable the trace is to both them and the runner, and they're setting the price. And then the runner basically chooses whether or not to buy protection from the trace at that price. It's also fast and easy. So you hit a trace, the corp spends money, the runner just chooses to spend money or they don't. The corp isn't going to overspend because if they spend all their credits, the runner's like, I spend nothing and I've gained an economic advantage from the trace. There's also a problem with the blind bid where, say you have 20 credits in your credit pool, I have 17 credits in my credit pool, and now we're going to a blind bid. So I have to like scrape off all of these credits from the table and like try to hide them from you and be like, I want to spend 7. How do I count out 7 without like showing you I'm actually bidding anything? Because maybe I want to bid 0. And so this system was much easier to actually implement. When you're dealing with multiple credits, blind bidding is actually really difficult to do. So the old game also had dice, and it used cards like Schlaghund and Playful AI and Bart Moss Memorial to add random effects to the game. And this kind of came down to the fact that dice are both double random and in-your-face luck. So what do I mean by double random? Well, in a card game, doing okay in time. In a card game, you already have this random element of shuffling the deck. And this is one of the most important things that you do. At the beginning of the game, if you shuffle your deck one more time, you've actually created like a parallel universe, because this game is going to play out incredibly different than in the universe where you didn't shuffle the deck one more time. So every time you shuffle your deck, you should really be thinking about, like, am I losing the game right now? I might be losing the game right now. However, as card gamers, we kind of just accept that. Like, it's just part of the game. We don't think about it that much. When you add dice, all of a sudden they become really sensitive to the fact that the game is random. There's the hidden shuffling, which you don't really want to think about too much. And then there's this dice. It's like, wait, dice? I lost from a dice roll, and maybe I lost because I shuffled my deck wrong? They're like, this game is random. It has no skill. I hate it. I will never play it again. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted people to play it again. So by removing dice from the game, we actually made the game less random, and that rewarded player skill. And that's something I think is very important. The game is incredibly skillful, and I didn't want people to lose just because of 10 bad rolls in a row. At least with the shuffling, you don't really know how it would have played out because you never get to play in those alternate universes. Also, in your face lock. Dice is in your face lock. So the question was how much randomness, and I'm like, less randomness is better, and so we removed dice. Bad publicity. So bad publicity was a concept introduced in the first and only expansion, the Proteus expansion for Netrunner. And the way it worked is that if the corp got 7 bad publicity, then the runner wins the game. So you had cards like Fake Hit, where you could give the corp bad publicity, and then you take some damage, or Scaldin, which is a virus where you roll a die at the beginning of your turn, and maybe it gives the corp bad publicity, maybe it doesn't. And then the corp could also give themselves some bad publicity with Charity Takeover. So I hadn't played the original Netrunner back when it was released in 1996, but I had played another game called Game of Thrones collectible card game, which was created by Fantasy Flight Games, and we converted it into an LCG a couple of years ago. But in the CCG version that I played, there was a mechanic called Doomed, and this was kind of similar to bad publicity. And so immediately upon seeing bad publicity, it brought back all these terrible memories of Doomed, because the way Doomed worked is that if you got 5 Doom cards in your dead pile, you lost the game. Well, there's a problem with kind of both of these mechanics, and that's that there's a lack of granularity. So if I get 6 points of bad publicity as the corp, that's great. I just got 6 points of bad publicity. What are you going to do about it? Until you give me that 7th point, nothing. That means that the 7th point is the most important point of bad publicity, and it doesn't matter if I have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. They're all the same functionally until I get that 7th point. Bad publicity also kind of shifted the focus of the game. So a lot of the cards that gave the corp bad publicity were cards that were non-interactive and didn't actually require the runner to run, which I think is an important part of the game. And so now it was kind of like, I'm building my combo deck, and I'm going to try to give you 7 bad publicity, and I'm just racing you to the end of the game to see if I can do that before you score points. So the solution to that was this. Looks complicated. You can actually boil it down to that, and it's the runner gains 1 credit each run per bad publicity. So this kind of did 2 things. 1, it made each point of bad publicity incredibly important. I've basically just doubled my efficiency as the runner if the corp has a bad publicity. Because remember, I can spend a click to make a run, and I can spend a click to make a credit. Now, if you have a bad publicity, I'm spending a click to make a run and basically gain a credit at the same time. So this is incredibly powerful. And if you have 2 bad publicity, now I make 2 credits each time I make a run. And so it scales incredibly well. And each point of bad publicity is going to feel like this burden on the corp, like, oh, I can't believe I got bad publicity. Are you kidding me? Which I want it to feel like. That seems more realistic to me. However, this means that we had to change the card pool. So now most of the effects that give the corp bad publicity are corp choice. You can't just give a corp bad publicity. You can try to by framing them, but most of the cards are corp choice. They're choosing to do these things that give them bad publicity and taking the burden of bad publicity on themselves. They can also do some nice things to remove bad publicity. All they seem fair. So I just kind of wanted to spend the last couple minutes of my talk talking about specific cards and some of the changes that we made or changes we didn't make to those. I think this is kind of important because you can have like the best theoretical design ever, and if you can't actually execute on a base level, it's just not going to be good. Like you could have the next Westeros or Middle Earth, and then you sit down at your keyboard and you're like, it was a dark and stormy night. And nobody's going to take you seriously. So the actual execution is, I think, an incredibly important part of any game design. So this is a card that gets a lot of discussion. Everybody who's played probably has seen it across the table from them. Scorched Earth. It is a straight reprint. I chose not to change the card at all from the old version to the new version. And the main reason I didn't change it is I think as far as the game goes, this is one of the most important ones. It is a game-defining card, and it basically means that the runner, this will deal 4 meat damage to the runner, so if you play 2 of these, they're potentially flatlined and dead. The runner always has to fear the corp. The corp is always afraid of the runner because the runner could get random accesses off the top of the deck and win, and this kind of levels the playing field. So even if you're winning, 6-0, it doesn't mean that you're safe and that you're going to win the game. And so this kind of instills fear into the runner in the same way that the runner, by running, instills fear into the corp. Planning consultants change the precognition. This is an example where factions really help the theme of a card. So a lot of the corp cards in the original game, because you didn't really know what the corp was doing or what their product was, were very like white collar business oriented. And in our game, Jinteki makes psychic clones. So let's show a psychic clone on the card instead of a guy in a suit. And so everything else about the card changed, but nothing else about the card changed except the art and the title. This is a card that shows that you can change too much. So the original Edge Runner Incorporated Temps was a card that gave the corp 3 actions, and you can only use these actions to install cards, and you don't have to use all of them. I'm like, that sounds complicated. Let's just say install 3 cards. That's what we're getting at. That sounds much easier. So I said install 3 cards. Well, this is a problem. Shouldn't have said that. The problem is that as the corp, each time you install a card, you have to pay an install cost. So if I'm trying to install multiple cards at a time, those install costs are going to potentially conflict with each other because each piece of ice costs more for each other piece of ice protecting the server. So if I want to install an ice in front of my server and then I want to install another ice in front of that with this card, how can I pay the cost if I'm installing them at the same time because one is contingent on the other one already being installed? So this was a bit of a problem, and we had to FAQ it to say like, nope, you always install cards one at a time even when we say you don't. And that's bad because now it's adding rules overhead that are outside of the game rather than inside the game and on the card. If we had actually used language closer to the original, you only have to worry about it when you read the card. Now I've created a rule that you always have to remember because it's existing outside of the card, even if you're not using the card.
And you wouldn't change the card text in future editions?
We are updating the card text, so like I don't know exactly what printing we're on the core set, but it will now say install up to 3 cards one at a time. So you will get the corrected version in future printings of the game. So this is a card, Data Broker versus Data Dealer, and it kind of shows some of the simplification that happened over the course of the process. In this case, I think it was good simplification. So Data Broker, as you can see, says, not that you can see actually, probably as you can't see, says action trash, 1 agenda point, gain 11 credits, 10 credits, 11 credits, can't tell, it's too small. And so in the original game, if you stole agendas and they're sitting in your score pile, you might not actually have that many points because you've spent those points on other effects, which you might not even be able to see anymore. So I could steal a bunch of agendas and have like 5 points worth of agendas in my score pile, and then all of a sudden I use the Data Broker a couple times. It looks like I have 5 points, actually I have 2 points. So now I have to track my points separately from the number of points actually listed on my agendas. So in the new version of the card, you actually have to just get rid of the entire agenda. You can't just keep it around in this like half state. It's giving me 1 of my 2 points. Nope. You either get rid of the entire agenda or you don't. Security purge versus accelerated beta test. So this was an opportunity. The old card, I guess I'll explain the old card first. The old card allowed you to basically reveal the top 3 cards of your deck when you scored it as the corp, and you could install and res ice for free. The new card, you actually don't reveal it to the runner. So the runner doesn't know what those 3 cards are. And this was an opportunity to add a little bit more bluffing into the game because now as the corp, if I have these 3 cards and one of them is ice and the other 2 are unknown to the runner, I can start doing things where I'm going to install that ice in front of archives where the other 2 cards are going, and maybe they think it's an agenda there and it's not, or I can choose not to install it over there, and maybe there is an agenda over there. So it just adds extra hidden information that the runner has to deal with, while also providing the corp with a slightly more difficult choice. Black Widow versus Femme Fatale. Femme Fatale just seemed like a more fitting name for a cyber noir game versus a cyberpunk game, and I think Android is more of a cyber noir game. There is a nice touch where her tattoo is actually of a Black Widow underneath her eyes, so that's a callback to the original card. We like to do like little hidden Easter eggs in card art all the time. And then finally, the Bart Moss Memorial Icebreaker. So this was a thorn in my side during development. As I mentioned before, I got rid of dice. This card used dice. I'm like, I like this card. It's a cool card. Let's try to change it so that we can basically use it without using dice. So in the first version of the card, rather than using dice to see whether or not it goes away, basically each time you use the icebreaker, you roll a die. If it's a 1, you trash it. Otherwise, it sticks around and helps you out. I'm like, let's discard the top card of our decks because that worked so well for skill checks. We must need to do it again. Nope, didn't work. It's a terrible, terrible idea trying to use cards in your deck as a random like number generator because they aren't random. You actually choose every card that you put into your deck. So you can abuse the card by creating, in this case, a deck that has no cards that cost 1 or lower. I was tying it off the cost of the card. So I tried some different versions of that, just didn't work. Eventually I'm like, well, if trashing is too much, I'll try like revealing. Obviously, again, decks are not random number generators and they shouldn't be. And kind of the breakthrough here was when I realized, why am I trying to add a random effect to the game if I actually remove dice because of their randomness? Like that just doesn't compute. And so we ended up with a card that has no random elements at all, and it's actually just a click efficiency card that rewards planning and good play. And this card went through probably 12 different versions before I figured that out, so I was a little bit slow on the uptake, but in the end I think it got to where it needed to be. And I do want to leave some time for questions, so let's go there now.
Get close because we don't have a mic. Or I'll take it off. Let's try that.
There you go.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was amazing. I have one question. With respect to your card design or your card, like with respect to set design, like you guys managed to design a core set that is still highly relevant, right? It has cards that when we initially played the core set, we weren't thinking about them as being very strong. We were just like, oh, these are cool. I guess in the future we won't be using them anymore. And yet we are very much using them. So how hard is it, like cycles and cycles down the road, to like maintain the relevance of the core set?
That's a really good question, and that's something that we set out to do kind of, is to make sure that the core set was a good entry point. Some of our other core sets in the past haven't kind of remained relevant as the card pool grows larger. And for Netrunner, I wanted it to feel like if I buy a core set, I can compete. Maybe the card pool is bigger, but I can compete. And so part of that was planned. A little bit of it was blind luck. Certain cards ended up being a little bit better than we anticipated, as always happens whenever you release cards. But overall, it's something that we are very cognizant of, and we recently announced like rotation, and so I think rotation will also help keep that core set card pool relevant, because the card pool won't grow as won't grow as long, won't grow as fast and as big as it would without rotation.
Time for a few questions.
One of the things with the most recent set, because the most recent edition, is about going into space and kind of running on the moon. How exactly does sort of the narrative flow and feel of the game affect your card design progressively as you keep designing cards?
So the question was kind of, how does the narrative affect the card design? It affects it a lot. A lot of times you hear people talk about top-down design versus bottom-up design, and it's always going to be a combination of the two when you make a card or a set of cards. But as we've kind of dived deeper into Netrunner, I've kind of started off more and more with the thematic overview of a set, like the lunar cycle, which takes place on the moon. And then the upcoming Sand cycle is kind of even an evolution of that, where I want cards to evoke a sense of place and atmosphere. And so a lot of times I'll start off with that place and think of like what exists in this space, and then how can we represent that in card form. Early on, it was much more like, here's all the cards in the core set that are from the original game. We did some new stuff, but here's a lot of stuff from the original game. And now it's much more like, we have our game, here's new stuff that we want to do to reflect that space. So the upcoming Sand cycle, in that set, we actually designed each pack individually, which was the first time we've done that, around a specific location. So like you actually have Breaker Bay, which is this college town, and everything in there relates to that place. Or the Underway, which has like a criminal element to it, and everything in that pack relates to its place. And so we wanted to kind of push the idea of narrative through the card choices and through the actual packs. Normally we make all the packs at once, all 6 of them, and then we just throw them into packs. But for the Sand, and hopefully going forward, we'll continue to kind of think of each pack as its own thing.
What advice would you give yourself about the game before you release it? Like, especially like the core set. Like, what would you go back and say? Maybe do this instead of that.
Right, that's a good question. I think overall I'm really happy with the core set. The one thing that kind of is continually a regret is some of the influence values on the cards, because they're so important when you're putting together and constructing your deck. It's the game before the game, and players really enjoy that aspect of it. And getting the influence values right kind of actually will change whether or not that card sees play. And in the core set, I think we erred on the side of being a little bit too cautious, and some of those influence values are too low and should probably be higher, which means that you see cards like Data Sucker and Yogg splashed more than I would like.
Can you talk a little bit about the playtest process?
Sure. So the playtesting is a process. That's a good way to put it. So normally I start out with, like an initial card list, and I'll actually iterate that multiple times, just kind of thinking through it and thinking through each card and how that card is going to be used and how that card wants to be used. And then I'll start internal playtesting with other people at Fantasy Flight, some local players, and we'll iterate that card list even more. And it's only after I'm kind of happy with kind of the base idea behind each card that I actually send it out to external groups. And we have a lot of volunteers, top-level players that we send the cards out to, and then they test and provide feedback, and we make changes, and you just iterate. Like, you can't play the game enough, you can't iterate enough. Eventually you will release the game and it will be done, but if there wasn't someone forcing you to release the game, I'd probably just go on iterating forever, because how can you ever get something like that perfect?
Certain deck archetypes can be stronger or weaker against other deck archetypes, which leads to some situations in tournaments where there may be an additional element of luck, that if you encounter early on an archetype that happens to be especially strong against yours, it might knock you out. Is that something that you guys have thought about in terms of tournament structure, and are there any ideas about that?
That's a good point. I actually think that's something that it can be frustrating for the player, but I actually think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that in addition to the skill of playing the game, you're actually also potentially going to have the skill of trying to read what the tournament meta is going to look like and what people are playing, and try to anticipate it, so that you can, if there is more of this deck being played and less of that deck, you actually have the counter to that deck. So I think it does actually reward player skill just by kind of allowing them to project and think about what's actually strong right now and whether or not there's any counters to it that can give them an advantage in the tournament. It is true that any given game you could just get a bad matchup and it's luck, but I think it's just kind of part of the card game experience, and I don't think there's anything necessarily that we have to do to address that specifically.